Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the third installment of the Bomber Entrepreneurship Network. It's a new and exciting opportunity for alumni, students, faculty, and friends of Ithaca College interested in aspiring to or working in the entrepreneurship space to connect and share ideas. My name is Brett Bozzard, class of 95. I am the Senior Executive Director for Alumni Engagement here at Ithaca College, and I'm happy to welcome you to tonight's session. We've got a great event in store for you. So as you're joining in, feel free. You can use the Q&A, the question and answer tool on your Zoom application, as you can ask questions throughout the evening. We're going to have a wonderful sort of fireside chat for this third installment of the Bomber Entrepreneurship Network. And to get us started, I'm happy to introduce Dean Michael Johnson-Cramer of the School of Business here at Ithaca College. Welcome aboard.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining us tonight.
Well, thanks for having me, and thanks for this gracious introduction. We're really excited. I guess I'll happily kick it off, and then if you'd like to introduce Tariq, before we bring Tariq on, I just wanted to thank you and your colleagues in alumni engagement for all the organizational work that's gone into this. And also to express our thanks to Thomas Grape, who a generous alum who has supported the Bomber Entrepreneurship Network, who's made this whole thing possible as we've tried to extend the learning that happens here on South Hill around entrepreneurship into the alumni base, into sort of a lifelong learning model. That's been very important as funding has really made that possible.
Yeah, thanks so much, Dean Johnson-Cramer. This is our third installment, and in its own way, is very entrepreneurial as a program. We've sort of taken advantage of time and opportunities that were available to us to have our first two sessions that were in person. And for this one, our first virtual session, we're very excited that we have a very talented alum, Tariq Meyers, class of 2014, who's going to be joining us tonight to have the chat with you. And I will get fully out of the way so that everyone can enjoy your conversation. And I'll come back on and moderate some questions once you two are finished. Tariq, thanks so much for joining us.
Of course, my pleasure. Hi, everybody. Welcome.
Thanks so much, Brett. So I'll jump right into it. As we were talking about a little bit backstage, as it were, I always model these fireside chats a little bit after inside the actor's studio. I really just want to hear the entrepreneurial journey. I know for folks who are entrepreneurship curious, getting started, an exposure to hearing from somebody who's come through their same educational experience can be really powerful and meaningful. And at the same time, people who are sort of at the end of their journey and have already been entrepreneurs, I know they'll have good questions for us and keep the conversation going when we get to the Q&A time. So that'll happen in a little bit. But Tark, I would love for you just to look back to your time on South Hill. Where did you imagine yourself headed, and where did entrepreneurship fit into that vision of your future, if it did at all?
Yeah, well, first, let me just thank the team for inviting me to this conversation. And while it's a little hard, as we were discussing before, to get back to the campus, it's always great to have the opportunity to connect with my forever family at different milestones in my career journey. And it's good to be with you, MJC, and just excited to have this conversation and share this journey. The reality is that I was one of those students who really didn't know what they wanted to do for the world, in the world, how they were going to do it. I was the first in my family to go to college. And even as early as applying to Ithaca College, it just had such an impression on my family and on my experience. I see Nicole Eversley Bradwell as a participant here, and it's remarkable to think about, back in 2010, as a ambitious young person coming out of Jesuit all boys high school, and faced with a number of opportunities to go different places, that my welcome to campus as an MLK Scholar prospect was so warm. And it was an experience that, I won't forget. And the person who gave me my MLK interview was Dr. Sean Eversley Bradwell. And so closing the loop there, just to have that warm welcome was very special. But for me, and I think a lot of first generation college students face this experience. We understand that we're supposed to go to school. It's like, this is what you got to do. But we don't always understand, once we're there, kind of how we can exercise some of our greatest gifts in the world. And a large part of that is, I think, due to the fact that, which will connect to, I think, a lot of the entrepreneurs in the room, that I didn't necessarily have access to mentors or professional networks that exposed me to entrepreneurship. I didn't really see a lot of CEOs that looked like me out in the world, and other tech founders. I didn't even know that really a tech industry existed, right? Like, I knew the apps that we had in our homes and on our phones, but didn't necessarily know that there were career opportunities available for folks like me, and for families like mine. I grew up in Boston, and I'm here now. It's funny how life works when it brings you. Sometimes when you leave school, it's a homegoing, and sometimes it's a homecoming, and sometimes you can do both. And that was kind of my experience. But I grew up in a community where the median net worth for a household like mine was $8 for Black families. And so once I was on campus, kind of bringing it full circle, I knew that I wanted to change that outcome for families like mine, but didn't necessarily know how to kind of exercise those gifts. I think one of the experiences that, not only being an MLK scholar and also just, having what I believe is, the best degree program out there, which is our politics program, that was very much informed by my experience in taking CSCRE courses, was that I was able to understand my why. I knew why I cared about the things that I did. I knew why I cared about, solving systemic inequity. I knew why I cared about identity politics. I knew why I cared about community change. And to be honest, though I didn't know necessarily what I wanted to do, that why really propelled my career and gave me the direction that I needed. It was my steady kind of North Star. And when I graduated from Ithaca back in 2014, I think that I pursued opportunities, didn't matter where they were, where my vocation, what I felt like I was called to do, and my occupation, what I was getting paid to do, was in full alignment. And despite some of the uncertainty in the world, that's what kind of kept me grounded. So that's kind of how I approached the world after graduation. Entrepreneurship really wasn't top of mind for me, but I kind of let my why be my guiding North Star. And before I even entered the tech industry, the first place that why landed me was actually at a racial justice nonprofit very far away from home in Berkeley, California, called the Greenlining Institute. And greenlining was named to be the signal in terms of the opposite of redlining, and the intention was that it would champion non-traditional civil rights issues, from access to democracy to access to healthcare, to access to affordable utilities, and closing the digital divide. And I was lucky enough to work on the economic equity team that I think enabled me to know that I chose the right why, to say the least. So that's a very long answer to your first question, my friend, but it was really that entrepreneurship was never something that I envisioned myself really getting a part of or ultimately landing in. But I learned very quickly that having a why will carry you very far in whatever journey you pursue.
I love that. I hear a couple of things in that are fascinating to me. I mean, I'm also first generation college, actually first generation high school grad on my dad's side. So, it really resonates to hear this idea that, not knowing what the paths actually even are. To me, I used to joke, like, the career choices that I assumed existed in the world were pretty much what the game of life had. You know, like you could spin the wheel and you could be a doctor or a lawyer or a business person. I didn't know what any of those actually meant, but
Right.
you know, there is something about not knowing what the path is that leads you onto a more interesting path. It sounds like that led, you know, in interesting ways. And the other question, so I was also a politics, political science major, and you know, it sounds like you had a very clear sense of the impact that you wanted to see in the world from a really young age. Why not politics?
You know, it's funny that you say that because I ask myself that every day. Um, you know, listen, I think that if there was like a consistent thread throughout my career, it's that every time I made a plan, it didn't go to plan. You know, being on campus, I was so sure I was going to be a congressional intern. And, you know, I recall back in 2008 where I saw a tall, a skinny kid with a funny name, you know, give an inaugural speech, right? In my high school's, that was video cast in my high school's, you know, auditorium. And I said for the first time, you know, besides seeing Deval Patrick run for office, that,
Mhm.
oh, wow, there's a path for me here, right? Like this could be an opportunity. So, of course, on campus, you know, there were, of course, dreams about becoming a congressional intern and getting involved in local government and that sort of thing. But I think what makes the politics department at Ithaca so special, I think compared to, you know, when I get to engage young people each and every day, you know, who either come from similar majors or have similar interests, it's that the IC politics department really helps you understand how to negotiate the world with a number of heuristics, right? That I truly believed helped shape the direction of my career. You know, I connect with political science majors who, you know, are so quant focused or, you know, on the other side of politics programs that have a pretty heavy social, you know, component. And I just felt like Ithaca gave me this gift where that you can exercise this passion for change and this passion for the politics of identity without necessarily having to initially bring those gifts to government just yet. To this day, I still have political ambition. To this day, I still think about, you know, how I could align myself with local government. It's part of the reason why I moved back home after 10 years because and I'm sure, you know, Dr. Bradwell could share this with you, you know, and even in my first interview that it was always my intention to bring the gifts of my experience, you know, back home. So that's always going to be on the journey. But I will also say that I think that folks who have the opportunity to, you know, experience an Ithaca education or experience some of the values that Ithaca College imparts on its graduates um, could, of course, go to the political space. But in that space, there are a number of folks who share a very similar lens, right? And a very similar vision for the type of world that we want to live in, and frankly, the type of country that you know, lives up to its promise. But for me, I also understood as I entered the tech space that there weren't too many voices like mine in that space. And so I had to make a choice pretty quickly. Do I, you know, carry this voice and add to what sometimes is an echo chamber of the type of community change that we'd like to see in our world? Or do I bring this voice and this lens to a space where we know innovation happens in hopes of bridging the gap to my peers who may share a similar mindset on the other path or on the other aisle. I was just reading this book actually about, you know, a series of leaders who, you know, are articulating what it's like to be in both venture and in entrepreneurship and also in government. And there's this unique link that while a lot of innovation happens within the technology space, government provides scale. And so, and we see that with Tesla, we saw that with SpaceX and others. And so I think that there's space, certainly in, you know, especially what we're seeing now in the political space to continue to evangelize this mission. But there's far more space, I think, in the private sector to be able to make sure that it's also thinking of the experiences of the folks who utilize their products and experience their brands each and every day.
So I know we'll come back around to that sort of sense of social mission and social entrepreneurship, when we get to Angel Squad. But before we go there, there was obviously a moment. I guess you're still in Berkeley, you're at Greenlining, working on that, and at some point you end up at Lyft. So you obviously chose sort of the tech space and the pure business, right? How did that transpire? And I guess, I'm always going to come back to that question of where was your thinking as an entrepreneur at this point? What was it brewing? What did you learn at Lyft that sort of put you on the path to business entrepreneurship?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. And uh, I was pretty, I'm sure that the founders of Lyft would say that I was pretty annoying in getting a job. So I was actually testifying at a hearing uh, up at the Capitol in Sacramento in California. And first of all, I was extremely nervous that day. I remember that day. And it was, the energy committee, and we had just gone after a commissioner from the Public Utilities Commission, and the chair of the committee was just this big guy who was super intimidating. And I'd only watched committees on C-SPAN as a nerd that I was, and I was like, oh my gosh, this is it. And right after testifying, there was these two gentlemen who talked about this pink and fuzzy brand, and described a vision for California communities where not only can two strangers get in a car and share space with one another, but a broader vision of what could be a world where cities were designed, around people and not cars, and began to describe, kind of coming out of the recession, still recovering from the recession, what economic opportunity can look like when an individual can just walk out their door, get in the car, and pay for, some meals for their family, or send their children to school, or save up cash to buy a home. And on the flip side, what could it mean for, members of our senior community to be able to access their medical appointments that were non-emergency, and not be crippled by, bills, like patients who have to go, take non-emergency rides each and every day to dialysis? Or what could it look like for, that family in Fruitvale, California, who have to go two cities over, in close proximity, but still out of reach, to be able to access some fresh produce, right? Because the neighborhoods that they live in didn't have fresh produce stores. Or even what could it look like for that dad who wakes up each and every day and has to leave work at 4 a.m. to make it to that 5 a.m. train, but unfortunately didn't have access to a bus service, right? That costs just the same amount as a Lyft ride would to get there. And I was just so inspired by this vision, because I've never heard a founder or a leader of a business really chat about or describe a product that could impact a community just like mine. And so I immediately went back to the executive director of Greenlining and said, I don't know what we have to do, but we have to partner with these folks. And ultimately, I helped form a partnership with Lyft, where we were dead set on, one, making sure that we were advocating at the state level to ensure that our drivers weren't disproportionately impacted by fingerprinting policy. And the second was that our drivers had, in our communities, especially folks who've historically been redlined by cab, the taxi cab industry, had access to safe and affordable rides. And that's just kind of the birth of that relationship. And 3 months later, they offered me a job to help build out their community affairs team. And kind of the rest was history. I was a techie at that point. And it was such an exciting opportunity for me, because I had the chance to bring what I felt like was a strong social lens to an industry that was values aligned with me. And so I did that job for a little bit before I transitioned roles internally.
You've been around the sort of Bay Area, a good part of your career, and around the Silicon Valley, version of tech entrepreneurship, and I know East Coast and West Coast can be pretty starkly different, in New York versus, what's going on in California. But, what you're describing around sort of the sense of what tech can do to enable a better society, to enable a more equitable or inclusive society, and solving any number of social problems you're describing, from food deserts to, healthcare access and everything in between. Um, do you get the sense that that is widely shared in the entrepreneurial ecosystem around tech, in the Silicon Valley, or is that as unique as it sounds?
I think it's a great question. I think that there are far more founders and startups out there with incredible social missions. And I think that the challenge that a number of founders and leaders have is remaining proximate to the issue. There are a number of founders who want to solve big, hairy, ambitious problems, but don't recognize that there are communities who've been working to solve those problems far longer than they have, and sometimes far longer than some of these folks have been alive. And so some of the challenges that I think that Silicon Valley or Silicon Alley or the emerging tech hub in New York or DC or Boston or Miami or the Carolinas, you name it, or Austin, is that founders have a hard time becoming proximate, to the experiences of the communities that they're hoping to serve. They have incredible ideas, right? And the understanding of this technology and its technology's potential, but falls short of actually engaging and connecting the very users and experiences that they're hoping to solve. Brian Stevenson talks about this experience, in his book Just Mercy, but he talks about there's power in proximity and power in, standing with the poor and vulnerable, the marginalized, the disenfranchised, the folks who have been cast out, and bearing witness. And unfortunately, more often than not, I see founders who have gone about the world with an incredible amount of, intellectual curiosity and prowess, but unfortunately have never spent more than an hour with the folks who could really benefit from the experiences that they need most. And part of my job at Lyft was to do this very thing, was to close this gap between what the leadership of Lyft really wanted to design as the product experiences and the needs, wants, and desires of users, not just drivers, but passengers as well. But I think it's a great observation, Dean Johnson-Cramer. And I think that we need more founders to get proximate to the communities that they're hoping to serve, in order to truly see the change that we'd like to see in the world.
Yeah, it's amazing to hear you say that, first, because those of us who follow Lyft and the sort of different path it's taken from Uber, at its core, that connection to and proximity to the community in a lot of ways has shaped its destiny. Even to today, the way it's perceived by users all over the world as much more connected to community. So that's interesting, and I hadn't thought of it in that outside the social entrepreneurship. I had the fortune of interviewing Jessica Jackley about Keep.org, and there it was entirely about sort of immersing herself in the developing community and understanding that. But that made sense from a social entrepreneurship network. I love that, I love hearing your experience with it, in your own space. So you've written elsewhere about your years doing sort of in-house D&I work and how it motivated you to think, identify, understand, and be passionate about solving the opportunity gap and, making the recruiting process more equitable. Can you talk specifically, and here I'm going to be the business school dean and say, how did that passion become Untapped? And specifically, sort of what was the business opportunity that allowed you to sort of turn the social mission and the passion that you clearly had, in this area into a business model?
Yeah, I love the question. So shortly after I joined Lyft, I, was asked by our founders to start kind of our culture and, diversity, equity, and inclusion program. We were doing incredible work on the ground, I think, to broaden the opportunity landscape for folks to have access to some level of earning potential. But we still had some gaps. And I think that there was a pretty quick realization. I joined as employee 97. This is about at the 600-person inflection point. And we recognized that we had some work, not only in terms of representation, but also in terms of equity and inclusion that we needed to do. And that ranged everything from, racial, ethnic, and gender representation at the organization, but also simply that, we had deaf and hard of hearing, passengers and drivers who needed some in-application support, right, to be able to utilize the product, and didn't have a deaf or hard of hearing engineer anywhere in the company. Like it just didn't make a lot of sense to me. And so I took on that role until we went public, and then decided and found another, company that I also aligned with this mission, which was to create, economic freedom for the world. That company ended up being Coinbase. Did the exact same thing for them until they went public. And then 2020 was like a really interesting moment for me, where we were kind of deep in, the global pandemic. We were an incredibly wild political just sphere of divisive rhetoric and folks not being able to have conversations, and they're already, sheltering in place. And so even these conversations are becoming more difficult. We saw a racial justice movement that was, absolutely intersectional and incredible, where, despite concerns about health restrictions and still dealing with the pandemic, folks took to the streets to call for greater equity in our communities, not just from their governments, but from, corporate America as well. I think that, we saw for the first time really in history that, corporate America wasn't just changing logos on LinkedIn or, isolating contributions to communities through, environmental social good or CSG programs, but or corporate governance programs, but instead we're actually putting their money where their mouth is by pledging $50 billion towards, racial and social equity in this country. And what came with that pledge, what came with all of that change, what came with the exposure of our healthcare system was a real, I think, reckoning in this country that where you are born, who you may love, who you may pray to, what zip code you're from, your parents' educational attainment, all of these factors could really influence your ability to access opportunity downstream. And as an in-house practitioner, I felt like me working for these individual companies was just not enough. And I felt like despite there being us being in an environment where capital was free flowing and so rich, there was still such a unique opportunity to be able to come up with solutions, but I didn't really see a lot of solutions in the market. And so I had to ask myself, all right, Tariq, what can you do in this space, and how can you be a force multiplier? And what I saw was this market opportunity where, so many folks were throwing dollars at, diversity and inclusion programs, and these practitioners were just faced with these huge mandates of like change the fabric of our organization within a year, which is nearly impossible, and needed a solution to make that happen. And when I looked across all of the different, generations in the workforce, where I found the most opportunity was actually among, emerging leaders and early in career talent. And why was that? It was that, 40% of, college graduates who are frankly already questioning the value of a post-secondary, credential could leave college or university and not even have access to an internship and or a new graduate opportunity. That same number of folks, nearly, it's about 51% or so, are working in jobs that don't require a college or degree. They're underemployed. And on top of that, the Federal Reserve released a report that, nearly that first job out of college is so important, and that just $10,000 more in earnings could result in, an additional $2 million more in lifetime earnings. And so seeing that as an opportunity, I said, how can I help these companies who say they're struggling with diversity, equity, inclusion, who say that talent, they care about D&I, but they just can't find that talent, who spent so much time on campuses of the top 14 schools, but don't necessarily make their way to the schools in their very own backyards or in communities like mine. How do I show and prove that talent is certainly universal, and that all you got to do is utilize a solution to democratize access to that talent? And that was the birth of Untapped. It was its mission is to make the world more equitable by broadening access to transformative careers. And our goal was really simple, like in a digital and virtual way, especially with the, the tailwinds of things going so virtual during the pandemic. How can I make sure that any company in this world had the ability to access any college student or career switcher or veteran or parent who might have taken some time off and are trying to re-enter the workforce? Like, how do I help folks find them? And that was the market opportunity for Untapped. Companies were spending, thousands of dollars each and every year accessing just a handful of campuses and communities. And I knew that I could come up with a solution that was far cheaper, that could enable them to access a wider reach and finally live up to their diversity and inclusion goals. And those very students that I knew could be, introduced to that network of companies will be our leaders for tomorrow. Will be the folks that are the change makers and the doers, the folks who have that grit and who have that tenacity, but who have been underestimated and overlooked by corporate America for so much time. And so that was the birth of the company.
Love that. I always think of opportunities as sort of these moments when two, three, four, five trends kind of converge. And what you're describing between the pandemic as a moment that sort of predisposed us to sort of clear markets and communicate virtually, much more quickly. We adopted that much faster. Another piece of that model that I think is fascinating, because I remember, having come into academia in the mid 90s, 95, 2000, McKinsey put out a report about the forthcoming war for talent.
That's
I
right.
remember the cover of the report had Uncle Sam sort of pointing, and they had all these recommendations, and I think that report went by the wayside, because it was so far in advance of 2020, that the demographic shift was really going to necessitate being creative, accessing the market, working with institutions that, frankly, I'm guessing schools that were elite schools. They'd already figured out how to diversify their student body, which was diverse in some ways and socioeconomically not necessarily all that diverse. Whereas you had many schools and many sort of sources of talent that, had solved the access problem to higher education, but not beyond that,
That's right.
schools regional and sort of community based and things like that. So I love that you sort of piece that together into a really interesting business opportunity.
That's right. That's right.
So, when I almost want to dispel this every time I say it, and at least wave my hands a little and say, not everyone thinks this way. But, when people think of entrepreneurship, they think about the search for funding, right? It's crowdfunding and Shark Tank and venture capital. And it's a big part of how people think of that founding moment, because it is a big part of, how to get started. As you look back at your journey, what have you learned that you'd want to share with aspiring entrepreneurs about getting funded, managing your relationship with investors, et cetera?
Yeah, I mean, listen, first, let me just acknowledge the fact that Untap was incredibly blessed with, finding incredible funders. We raised over $70 million over the lifeblood of the company. And, to be honest, that experience, especially for founders that look like me, is far more of the exception than the norm. And specifically for, women of color, the founding journey and the investment gap is even larger. And so I just want to acknowledge that, because I think that, we were incredibly, I think, blessed and lucky to, secure investment from folks who believed in us. But this journey is a hard one. In a world where less than 1% of startups are successful, sometimes funding can, be the make or break it of whether or not you have enough RMLs or remaining months left to actually find the spark or the solution that really gets you over the line. So I just want to acknowledge that moment. Funding is stressful. Funding and securing funding is tough, but when you can get it right, it can make all of the difference. There's so many things that I can share here, but I think the number one takeaway I'll say is that not all funding that glitters is gold. And sometimes when your back's against the wall, you really want to take that check. But it's just not all the same. The advice that I would give to folks about their funding journey is that you're going to hear hundreds of no's before you get that one yes, is the first thing. Sometimes you'll get your first yes, and it's not the right one for you. And so the way that I appreciate evaluating funding opportunities are a few things. One, can they add strategic value to the business? So if there's a particular industry that you're in, or there's a particular issue that you want to solve, does the funder or the investor have experience in this space, or are they just trying to throw capital at you? Is the first thing. Two, what other types of fund portfolios have they invested in? And do those portfolios reflect the experience or the users that you're hoping to serve? I think that who investors invest in says a lot about who they are and a lot about their values. And so if you don't feel as though your values are aligned to theirs, it may not be the best opportunity for you. Three, what does the partner or investment team really look like? What are their experiences? What are their backgrounds? What do they care about? Has there been successful exits under their belt? The list goes on. But I think if there's one piece of advice I can share is that, what makes an investment relationship successful, whether it's a small check, an angel check, or a larger series round, is the level of trust, chemistry, and connection you can have with the person who ultimately will have a board seat at your company. And that's been, I think the biggest blessing for the community of folks that we've been able to build over the course of our various series, seed, Series A, Series B, and Series C, with Untapped. The folks that we have built relationships with will be lifetime mentors and friends to us. Myself and my co-founder, one just wrote my Harvard Kennedy recommendation like 2 weeks ago in less than an hour. These are just folks that we will always call upon for mentorship and advice, because they didn't just stick with us when things were great. They stood for us when things were really tough. They had our backs. And that is the definition of an incredible investor relationship. And it doesn't matter what size of the check there is. That's ultimately what makes a successful relationship.
I love that. That's such a great piece of advice, and yet I also think you were, forthright at the outset. It's hard, and of course the tendency, it's almost like a job search. The tendency is to go so hard into selling yourself that you may not even have the ability to sort of step back and hear, the signals of whether that person or that institution or that investor in this case, it fits with the things that are going to be healthy for you over the long term. Can you give us an example of sort of somewhere along the process as you worked with investors, how you knew they were going to turn out like they have, frankly?
Yeah, their curiosity about who you are, about your vision, the type of questions that they ask are very telling to how interested and invested they are in your overall journey. Do they want to really dive into the mission? Do they already offer value when they first learn about the product experience, et cetera? Like, I can't overemphasize that curiosity goes a long way, because ultimately, there are a number of folks in the investment community who are incredibly bright, but they may not always lean in. And if they can give you a nugget, it's just like choosing an executive coach in some ways. The best executive coaches that I've worked with are the ones who spend the first 30 minutes of us first meeting saying, let's work through a problem together, right? Those are the type of folks that you just want on your team. And the last piece that I'll just share there is that you don't just want investors who love you when you're at your peak of your growth. You want investors who are willing to ride for you and are willing to invest in you when they see a growth opportunity. And I hope that distinction is clear, especially for emerging technologies. Right now, everyone's focused on AI, but not even 2 years ago, everyone was absolutely interested in the future of work HR products, talent products, et cetera, because we saw such a significant shift in the ways in which we live and work each and every day. And when you're a successful brand or you're a brand that has some attention, of course, the floodgates open with folks who want to be able to ride the upside in your potential. But what about those folks who had your back when you might have gotten a bad piece of press, or you haven't made the headlines in a while, or maybe your recurring revenue or your annual revenue or your quarterly revenue is not where it should have been, but folks see the potential in you and your grit and they want to be part of that journey. That's such a telling moment for for someone who really cares about you, not only as an investment opportunity, but also as a founder.
You mentioned that unfolding of revenue, and I want to pull in a question one of the attendees threw up in the Q&A, which I love. As you're looking back over the timeline of Untapped, could you talk about sort of the moment when you realized that you actually had a company that could generate a consistent profit?
Yeah. Repeatable revenue is tough. I'll say this. When we got our second check, the first check, you feel really lucky. You're like, wow, like, they really believe in us. Like, it was like a $5,000 check, for a year-long contract. And I think that it felt really good. We're like, there's just no way, no one who are we? Like no one's gonna pay for this. And then you get your second one. And your second one makes you feel like, okay, we got something here. And the second one becomes a third one, etc. I to zoom in a bit, I think that, we knew that we had something special when the folks that we were serving were referring their peers at other companies, right? So think about this. We're in the tech industry. The early in career market is quite small within the tech and finance industry. Like there are far more graduates and applicants than there are seats available for internships and new grad opportunities. So folks are competing for talent. When you have folks like my alma mater, Lyft, referring 3 other companies that they compete for talent for to utilize this product, it says a lot about what you've built. And so the second check feels really good. Just shout out to anyone who gets their second check. It is a beautiful thing. But 2, when the product can sell itself through the relationships and the experiences that you're providing for a customer, even if it's not perfect, that's when you got something that you can really unlock. That's when that you might have something that's repeatable, especially if they're willing to sign a long-term contract. The second inflection point of whether or not you're delivering value and can bank on that revenue is when you have to renew that contract. Doesn't mean someone's had the best experience with you, but what I found more often than not with the 100 plus companies that we've worked with is that typically folks are buying Untapped because of the team that's building it and the belief that the team can actually make a significant difference in the world. I'd like to believe that I've cultivated the mentality amongst my employees that they can have an impact on their surroundings. And that's just really attractive for companies who also cultivate that mentality. So second check, product sells itself, and when they renew, all signals that you got something special going on.
Yeah, that word of mouth piece too. I mean, I think, people being willing to invest in the long-term health of the overall platform, that had to feel great to sort of see that happening and realize, yeah, this kind of has a flywheel effect that's going to carry, and make this succeed.
Yeah, I mean, it wasn't an easy journey. I mean, there have been real low points where we didn't know if we were going to have another year. And I think that's also, I think that we sometimes romanticize what it means to start to found a company. I remember, when I first founded Untapped, going through all these Steve Jobs videos and just being so inspired, and this idea of think different when that marketing campaign came out and what that actually meant, and using that to motivate the team. Or reading, blogs from LinkedIn's founder about why every employee is asked what they want to do after LinkedIn and this power of having a transformative employee experience, or reading the Netflix culture doc. But let me be super clear. This is a hard fight each and every day for survival. And I don't want to romanticize the experience too much, but what I will say is, and I think this was one of your questions too, Dean, around like, I think this leads to the Angel Squad question. But there was a question around, what do investors and other folks look for in their founders? And I think the number one thing that I always hear is this idea of grit, that there are not always going to be pretty days. And the survival of the company may be a day by day thing, but that grit is what gets you to the next day. The ability to put your lifeline on the line for the company.
Yeah, it's funny that I happen to be watching the Steve Jobs talk when he comes back and unveils Think Different, which by the way was filmed by IC grad Jason DeLand.
Did
He
you know
sort of
that, Steve? The connection.
bootlegged the video and it all, somebody leaked it on YouTube and it became sort of public domain. But people forget that that was a really hard moment for Apple. I mean, it
Right.
was in a dying industry. Computer hardware was, just in an awful spot, and Apple was in the most awful spot in an awful industry at that moment. So.
That's
Um,
exactly right.
even the most romantic story isn't quite as romantic as we think of it. I love that. So in February, you and Untap embarked on this new chapter with the acquisition, the Podium acquisition. How has this changed your experience as an entrepreneur? What are the upsides? What are the downsides? What's been your experience with the acquisition?
I feel like it's like my baby has just gone to college and just, just out in the world, existing under someone else's leadership. No, I think that there was so Podium Education, just for context, is, an online learning platform that, partners with colleges and universities across the country to help bring essentially companies closer to the classroom by supplementing and complementing some university coursework with some in-demand skills that I think set some candidates apart in the internship and new grad opportunity search. My job there now is Chief Careers Officer, which is just a fancy way of saying that I wake up every day thinking about how to help young folks gain access to opportunity. That's it. And I try to bridge that gap, especially for folks who have been overlooked and underestimated by bringing recruiters and CEOs and VPs and leaders closer to students as just another voice alongside provosts and faculty members and you name it. So it was just such a natural fit when we were acquired by Podium because we were like that third leg of their strategy that they needed, which is like give me access to a career network because we have the company relationships. But acquisitions are tough. I mean, I kept my team on board and, company integration's tough. I was very intentional about building the Untapped culture, built an incredibly diverse team, an incredibly diverse leadership team. Sometimes not every individual feels like an acquiring partner is the right fit for them. So you lose colleagues and folks who have been in the struggle with you, at least in the professional context, where they become lifetime friends. Melding values. It's a new way of operating, a new way of being, a new way of existing. I haven't had a supervisor in a while. That was a tough transition, because I had to kind of, understand what it was like to be managed again and, but also still make decisions for the product. So let me tell you, acquisitions are fun. They're an exciting opportunity, but they come with their challenges. I think that the piece that has kept me grounded and excited is that I have a way to further Untapped's vision and to see it morph to something else. And I think that also, part of acquisitions means that you have to start thinking about what comes next. Like I'm someone, if you follow my career, Dean, has always been someone who understands when the mission is over and when it's time to move on to the next thing. And it is really difficult to follow your instincts and understand, as someone who personally is built for building and not necessarily maintenance, when is it time to pass that baton to the next incredible individual who will further this vision? And that's happened at so many inflection points in my career, my very short career, but still enough of them to know what it feels like. And And so I'm in this place right now where right now I'm at Untapped/Podium and I'm loving it and I'm experimenting and I'm saying, what are you going to do with my baby? And let's figure it out. But at the same time, I'm also so open to figuring out how I can exercise my gifts next. And just like I told you at the beginning of this conversation, things don't always go according to plan. I'm kind of over making plans now. And I'm just like, life is just going to bring me where I need to be to exercise my gifts next. But my North Star isn't changing. Like same post acquisition is the same way I feel pre acquisition. That I still hold this belief that people shouldn't be defined by their life circumstances, but empowered to defy them. And I'm going to work each and every day, probably for the rest of my life, to make sure that things don't get in the way of people actualizing. Like that's just what I want to do. And I don't know where I'm going to do that, but I'm going to keep doing it till somebody tells me to stop.
I love that. I love that. Yeah, I remember you talk about sort of the evolution of the organization, suddenly having a boss. My early days were in sort of tech startups in and around the MIT campus. So I was in that kind of
Yeah.
Cambridge-based, tech world. And there was a population of folks who, they would leave as soon as somebody handed out lanyards, created an org chart, or we hit employee number 30. There were at least a handful of people who were
Right.
ready to move on to the next thing. But, I think your version of it in terms of keeping that North Star, and that is just a really compelling way to live in what is increasingly a gig economy for everybody, right?
Yeah.
The numbers bear that out. So let me conclude with the last question I had for you, which is looking back to IC, is there any course or professor that continues to resonate with you or shape this journey of yours that you're on?
So many. I mean, listen, I just want to double down on this. Shout out to the CSCRE. If there was a CSCRE major when I was on campus, I would have been that brother. But I just want to, shout out, Dr. Bradwell was amazing. Dr. Polly Wenide was amazing. I know that, Patricia Rodriguez, I think, has since left campus, and Beth Harris and Zila Eisenstein. But all of these folks, all of these giants, I just have really shaped the way that I view the world. And I think my encouragement, wherever this recording goes, is it doesn't matter what major you are. Be a zoology major. It doesn't matter if you're in the music hall. It doesn't matter if you're a politics major or you're sitting in your building. Dean MJC. Like, I believe that this, the opportunity to be on Ithaca's campus is an opportunity towards entrepreneurship in the same way that I got entrepreneurship during my first job at Lyft and others, in the sense that this is your playground. And I think the experiences and the lenses that you form in the classroom 100% inform the way you move about this world. And I would not be where I am today if it wasn't for those individuals that I shared prior, but also the number of folks across alumni engagement, to my time as a student trustee, to folks in OSEMA. I don't know if it's still called OSEMA, and all these different places. But just don't miss out on the opportunity to soak up all you can on campus, because it is truly what makes you different out in the workforce. And yeah, anytime this campus will call, I'll always answer for that very reason. And it's been a pleasure to be with you. And Brett, thank you, sir, for organizing this and for being an incredible host.
It was great to be here and great to sort of just take in this conversation. You both led us on quite a journey, and I always appreciate when an alum is willing, actually excited to come back and talk about their experience both on South Hill and what their experiences on South Hill empowered them to do and become once they leave. It's I think your story today and the words you just shared really say a lot for just how unique that student experience is at Ithaca College, the bonds between the educators on campus and the students that are learning alongside them. Really, I think that's one thing that is always very exciting, is you feel like the professors that are here on campus are continuing their own journey. They're continuing their entrepreneurship as well. And I think that this effort, the Bomber Entrepreneurship Network, is something that is springs forth from that spirit that is sort of, I think, inherent to the Ithaca College campus and the institution at large.
Well, thank you for that. And thank you for having me. And I'm always here. So next time you're in Boston, to both of you, for folks who don't know, Brett skipped the Boston event. So now you got to bring Brett
Sorry.
to, to
Yeah.
the Boston event. But no, anytime, I'm more than happy to be here. And just thank you both for your leadership and for bringing folks like me back closer to the campus. I know that, I certainly am not the only story. And I think you know this well, of folks who have benefited from your leadership. So I feel very lucky that you've had me on here today, and just thank you so much. And if I don't see you in Boston, I will do my best to take the flight or the bus or the drive, whatever it takes, or the boat
It's
back to Ithaca campus. I'll be there.
a couple steps. There's some portage along the way. Sorry. Yeah.
My pleasure. Thank you both.
Well, thank you both for being part of this tonight, and for folks watching at home, this is obviously the third, but certainly not the last installment of this effort, the Bomber Entrepreneurship Network. There will be more in-person events coming up soon. Dean Johnson-Cramer, I don't know if we have anything. I don't think we have anything officially set yet, but we do know that there'll be something coming up in the spring. An in-person opportunity for alums in some area, metropolitan area in the Northeast, to meet with each other, to hear from alums that are doing great work in this space, and also have an opportunity to meet with and talk with current students who are looking to sort of blaze their own path in this world. So please do stay tuned. This recording will be available online on the alumni.ithaca.edu website, as are the recordings of our previous two Bomber Entrepreneurship Network events. So for folks that are tuning in tonight and just finding out about this program, you can catch up by visiting the website. So please stay tuned. And if you have any questions or are very interested as you're watching to be part of this network in a greater fashion, reach out to alumni at ithaca.edu, and we will certainly do our best to get you added to the list for what's next with the Bomber Entrepreneurship Network. Thanks again to you both for being here tonight, and thanks everybody at home for watching, and we'll see you soon. Take care.
Bye, y'all.